It's a tingle in your fingers and a tingle in your feet. Rhythm in your bedroom, rhythm in the street. Yes, the rhythm of life is a powerful beat. And the rhythm of life is a powerful beat. Puts a tingle in your fingers and a tingle in your feet. Rhythm in your bedroom, rhythm in the street. Yes, the rhythm of life is a powerful beat. Flip your wings and fly to your daddy. Take a dive and swim to your daddy. Hit the floor and rock to your daddy. Daddy, got the rhythm of life, of life, of life, of life.
Hi, my name's Dominic Brennan and I'm the Managing Director of Clos Fine Wine. Thank you very much for clicking onto this video, which I hope will give you a bit of a background onto Bordeaux 2023, following on from my videos on the 2022 vintage last year on YouTube. I thought I'd start by giving you a bit of an overview of the campaign, the vintage itself and some of my picks. I spent about a week, about a fortnight ago, crisscrossing Bordeaux, the left bank, the right bank, and looking down south in Pessac as well, tasting as many wines as I could, as many times as I could. So I have obviously a very personal view on the vintage, but it seems to be shared, seems to chime in even with lots of the top critics, which is reassuring. So I thought I'd give you a bit of a context on where this vintage sits relative to recent vintages, what the actual campaign will and might look like, and some of my personal picks. If we first start with the vintage itself and the conditions which created the wines we were tasting and that will be going to be sold across the world, yet again we had extreme weather events following on from the frosts of 2021, which devastated yields, and then we had a really hot solar year in 2022, which meant that the drought was a real issue in the region. In 2023, we had something called mildew, and mildew is a fungus that thrives in humid environments. So it was another extremely hot, above average year for temperatures in Bordeaux, but also a couple of months, June in particular, saw above average rainfall. What that meant was the heat and the rain create a really humid environment, and that's the perfect conditions in which mildew can thrive. Now, mildew is a fungus which attacks the vine leaves, it attacks the fruit as well. And one of the best ways of combating it is to spray a sort of a copper compound, which is a organic and biodynamic treatment. Now, it was a real case, as usual, of the haves and the have-nots. If you have a very famous first growth estate, or an estate that's owned by an insurance company or an international bank, then you have the financial and the people power and the resources to spray 7 days a week, because of course Mother Nature doesn't take a day off. So you might send your team away on the Friday for the weekend, and then on the Saturday it's very hot and it rains, and then mildew becomes a threat. So you've got to act really quickly in those conditions to prevent mildew from growing and forming. And if you are a small family-run chateau, one of the thousands in Bordeaux that aren't in the top sort of 4 or 5%, and maybe you have a team of 3 or 4 or 5 of you, you're not going to be able to get around your vineyards in a quick manner, assuming you are available to spray at all. So this meant there was a real discrepancy between, as I say, the haves and the have-nots in Bordeaux, which has sort of always been the case. One of the quirks of vine growing is that the state of a vine and its readiness to create high quality fruit is almost really predetermined by its performance in the previous vintage, both during the flowering of that previous vintage and then in the dormancy over winter when the vine shuts down and recovers for the year ahead. And 2022 was a great year, I say a very, very good year in Bordeaux, not great year, but it was a very good year, and it was very dry and very hot. So it did mean that the vines were in quite a good position during dormancy. It was quite a wet January in Bordeaux, and that just meant that the soils were, saturated with water, which meant there were reserves for later in the year when it did get hot. The vines started their bud burst end of March or early April, depending on where you were in Bordeaux. And really, from there until harvest, to really super simplify what is a huge region, the growth of the vine and all the sort of myriad components of that across the year chronologically, were largely done in very good conditions. However, mildew was a threat. Disease pressure was a threat because of a couple of deluges of rain into the start of June, end of May and start of June in particular. June, for example, saw really high above average rainfall for the region, coupled with above average heat, which was, again, the perfect breeding conditions for mildew to grow. But really, apart from the disease pressure, which every chateau faced, and I did visit chateau, which said we had no issue with mildew, we weren't affected. And I think, if I'm being completely cynical, I think that's a bit of a lie. I don't see why there needs to be that sort of that news coming out of the chateau when clearly everyone's affected by the same disease pressure. How you combat it might differ, of course, from chateau to chateau, but it was an issue that affected everyone. To say that it didn't, I think, is a bit disingenuous. One of the great things about the vintage is that it's plentiful in its yield. For the first time in about 3 vintages, we're getting back to what the average yield should be. And lots of chateaux were sort of happily trumpeting that they had between 40 and in some cases sort of 50 or 60 hectolitres in terms of their yields, the amount of wine they produced, which is great because it means for us as consumers, there's more wines go around, more quality wines go around. And it means that hopefully the last couple of campaigns where yields have been low and prices have gone up can be reversed. Harvest occurred from August onwards, all the way into the end of September, start of October in some areas of Bordeaux. And it happened in perfect conditions. And what you don't want when you're harvesting is rain. There was the threat of some rain, and rain did fall in some places later in the harvest time across Bordeaux. But I don't think dilution was a real issue for grape growers on the whole. And then when the grapes arrive, they're receipted into the winery. The methods of sorting the grapes range from, in some places, completely by hand to optical machines, which are very cool. They measure the perfect grape, and then they will use technology to knock out at a very quick rate any berries which don't quite match the optimum type of grape. And then there's flotation devices which look at the density of a grape and judge grapes on whether they make the cut or not that way. So what does it all mean for the vintage itself and the quality of the wines that were made, bearing in mind the vintage conditions? Well, it was a real heterogeneous vintage yet again, so that means the quality across the region wasn't the same. And often critics or brokers will talk about their favourite appellations. So some people will walk around Bordeaux during primeur week and they'll say, I love the wines from Margaux, they're obviously the best wines this year. And people will say, oh no, I thought the wines of Saint Estèphe were the best, or Pomerol the best. And obviously it's fine to have your favourites. I just think that in a year like 2023, it's far too simplistic to talk about a particular appellation being better or worse than another. I'll put an image up, hopefully now, of a map from Château Lafite of the rainfall across Bordeaux. And you can see that A, no one escaped, but B, just how different the densities and the amount of rain that fell were across all the different parts of Bordeaux. And that really affects how good the wine's going to be. So also you have to consider that the soil types are different across Bordeaux, and Jane Anson has done a lot of wonderful work and research into the different sort of layers of rock and soil underneath different appellations. So those minute differences that give a certain terroir its specific identity are all going to play in certain vintage conditions into how the wines ended up knitting together. For me, I thought the wines were a real treat to taste. En primeur, tends to be a relatively difficult thing to taste. The wines tend to be overly tannic, bright purple, but there has been a move, certainly in the last 10 years, I feel. The wines are much more driven by terroir, there's a lot more freshness even in the hotter years. Whereas 2021 was called this sort of classic or winemaker's year, which is really just a sales pitch, I think, from a lot of brokers. And 2022 was a very hot year, so we had very ripe wines with lots of ripe fruit and high alcohols, but you had these very punchy colours. 2023 for me is a vintage which has gorgeous ripe fruit and fresh fruit, not just overripe jamminess, but a real ripe freshness of the fruit, whether it's the sort of wild strawberry or raspberry notes from some of the Merlot, or blueberry notes, and then some of those gorgeous darker hued black cherries and black currants or bilberry and red and black plums that you get from some of the Cabernets and some of the Cabernet Francs. They're a real joy to taste. The tannins are ripe, so the tannins that sort of congregate around the gums and provide that chalkiness and that dryness. They were on the whole for me ripe and quite present in this vintage. Again, it depends how the wines were treated in the winery. That had a big impact on how much you felt the tannins and how well integrated they were into the wine. But I felt on the whole, across the entire region, from Pessac up to Santa Stefan across to the right bank, that tannins were really good. And when they needed to, they did give bite and texture and spice and helped often persist some of the better wines on the finish. But never to the detriment of freshness. And the other thing which I think marks out 2023 from the most recent vintages that I've tasted is the sense of minerality and structure. And that would have been because of, you know, those periods of rain, because you've got wines that, yes, it was a hot year and there's ripeness in the fruit, but you've also got wines that have a sense of place and freshness and minerality and mineral structure throughout them. And that getting those two things together is often quite a hard thing for a producer to nail. And I think they really did across the region in 2023. I love tasting them, and it's a good sign when you enjoy tasting wines which are, you know, extremely young barrel samples. Another thing that was really interesting for me personally, I know lots of people in the wine trade would have done this before in Bordeaux, but it was actually the first time in Bordeaux that I've tried samples direct from barrel. There are lots of apocryphal tales of, in the past, the estates making a particular special blend of a vintage to try and impress the critics so they get a higher score. So lots of skullduggery and sort of dirty tricks. But I thought it was really, really interesting to note that on a few places I went to visit, Canon was one and Rouse and Cellular was another one, but both owned by the same company, incidentally, where they would take us to the barrel room and get us to choose any barrel we wanted to taste their wines. Not just that, because that gives you a really interesting insight into the wine, but also to test from different barrels. Rouse and Cellular, for example, uses 7 cooperages, so 7 different brands or types of oak barrel. And the differences, the minute differences between those 7 barrels were really astonishing and really obvious as well. And we also tried barrels that we had done an entire vintage before, so they were almost used or old barrels where the fruit is allowed to sing without any of that oak influence. And it's the job of the cellar master really, or the blender, to mix all of those components together to make a cohesive wine, which has, you know, some of that suppleness from the oak, but also doesn't lose the heart of the wine, which is the freshness of the fruit and the ripeness. So I find that a really interesting thing to try, and I really, really enjoyed doing that. Again, whether it was from barrel or in bottle, I found these were really enjoyable wines to taste, very supple. I was lucky enough to try a couple of wines twice, some at the bigger UGCB tastings in Bordeaux, and then again at the properties. And it's quite nice when you have consistent notes, so that wasn't always the case. Compared to a lot of the top critics who get to try the wines 4, 5, 6 times, which obviously is great for offering a sort of agnostic opinion of the wines. We don't, in the trade, we might get 1 or 2 shots at a wine purely for time reasons, and obviously because we're not as important, put it that way. So I really enjoyed tasting 2023 en primeur, and I think purely from a drinking point of view, they offer a lot of pleasure across both sides of the river. I note that a lot of the critics in their critical reports, whether it's, you know, Neil Martin at Vinous or Jane Anson or William Kelly at the Wine Advocate, and so on and so forth, there are lots of great critics, do make a point of saying that they're judging the wines purely on on the quality of what's in the glass, trying to do it completely agnostically, which is quite right. That's the way that a critic should test wine. It shouldn't be, they shouldn't be there to also consider perhaps the economic impact of the pricing of the campaign or geopolitical issues. Of course, they're going to talk about those things, but the most important thing for a consumer is, how does the wine taste? How will it age? Is it well made? So in that vein, I think the wines are fantastic. I think the sort of snow-capped peaks of the vintage really do stand out. And I do note there are a couple of properties that I felt had made wines which were some of the best I've ever tasted there in my short time in the wine industry. And also perhaps showing the advances in technology and agronomic advances as well in the vineyard, and winemaking techniques altogether. There were fewer and fewer wines this year that I just didn't like or didn't enjoy, that I didn't feel were well-made wines. I think I can count on one hand maybe 3 or 4 wines which I thought were badly made. And for me, they tended to show a lot of alcohol on the finish, on the tip of the tongue. And I'd go back and taste with other people and they would agree. So for me, it was unbalanced alcohol in a couple of wines, but that really was just 3 or 4 across I would say 300 or 400 that I tried in the region. So on the whole, compared to more recent vintages, there was a lot to enjoy at all levels, from Cru Bourgeois all the way up to the first growths. And I think for anyone that likes drinking Bordeaux or even just, really decent red wine, there's a lot to enjoy and a lot to look forward to from these wines. They are going to be drinking well early on, but they will also reward, aging in time. There's a lot of classicism in there, some really good mineral structures, as I've already mentioned. So I think it's definitely a vintage to follow, and I'll come on to pricing in a minute, but if it's priced well, it really is going to look quite appealing indeed. It wouldn't be a report on the vintage if I didn't talk about the market itself, and I seem to write in my emails to clients over the years, and now in videos, mention a slight unease about en primeur. En primeur originally was meant to be this idea that, to inject cash into chateau. They'd offer wines when they were in barrel before they were physical, and then buyers, for example, in the UK, would buy a case or two. And over time, naturally, because you bought them at almost a discount to help the chateau, when your wines are bottled and delivered to the UK, over time, they go up in value to match the current market value, and then you'll be able to sell one, which will pay for you to drink the other one essentially for free. As investment has come into wine, in terms of people treating wine as an asset class, fine wine investment, that sort of supercharged the whole process. And for a long time, it was a process that worked. I mean, when done correctly with proper investment criteria, the fine wine market has delivered really well in terms of Bordeaux en primeur. However, in recent years, speaking frankly, I think Chateau have got very greedy. You can understand why, because they make the wine. They spend all year making a wine and then selling it, only to watch everyone else make money off it. So Chateau Latour was the first big chateau to extricate itself from the en primeur process. It now releases the wine when they think the wine is ready, which is completely fair. And they do so at roughly the market value for that wine at the time. So they make any of the gains in the market value, they make themselves. What it has meant is that over time, the chateau, as I said, have got greedier. And to play into that, the negociants, who are 2 steps down from the chateau, we have the chateau, then we have the courtiers, who are sort of almost like football agents, and they are the go-betweens between the chateau and the negociants. And the negociants, over time, I think, have also had the same idea, because often they have to buy a lot of stock to service brokers across the world in lots of different countries, and they have to leverage that by protecting themselves and holding on to stock. So if it does go up in value, then they can offer it to brokers at a higher rate, so they can make some more margin themselves, which again I can understand. What it has meant though is that the sort of slice of the pie for the end consumer, the man or woman on the street, has got smaller and smaller, to the point where in recent campaigns it's almost been non-existent or almost punitive. And I think it really came to a head in the 2022 vintage, which I did a whole video about, which I will link here. It was a vintage that was a very, very good vintage, a wonderful vintage, but it was priced at quite extraordinary levels. And it really was a lot of greed, I think. And I go into that in my video about some of the reasons why it shouldn't have been so. So we come to a time where it's impossible not to be aware of the sort of the ongoing financial pulse of the world. We have rampant inflation, interest rates continue to be very high. The cost of borrowing money from either for a chateau or for a negotiant or for a broker like me or for you at home with your mortgage or your savings, interest rates have gone up. The cost of goods has gone up. Of the cost of glass, of cork, of paper, of energy, to keep those cellars chilled and the right humidity throughout the year. So costs have gone up, but also the appetite for consumers to spend money has gone down. That's clear for all to see, I think. So the Bordelais are apparently aware of this. They made a big point of saying across the region during En Primeur week that they were aware that there was a lot of pain that buyers had experienced, and they were willing to do their bit to help re-inject some life into En Primeur. If they do that, then Bordeaux 2023 could be a really fantastic vintage to stock up on for drinking for the longer term. There are bottles from £6-7 a bottle up to the first gross, which I think will deliver incredible joy. And if they are going to be released at drops in price of anywhere from 20 to 40%, then I think it's really one to go big on. When I cross the region tasting the wines, I would always ask at Chateau if there were going to be price drops and how generous they would be. And most commercial directors are quite open in saying when their wines would be released and that there would be generous drops. This is now a very early campaign. Normally we come back from Bordeaux and there are 2 or 3 weeks, and then mid to the end of May the campaign starts. The campaign started literally a few days after En Primeur week finished, which was now last week, and we've been able to see already how Chateau have behaved in terms of their pricing, and the news so far is really promising. So Léopold Lascasse, who made a totally brilliant wine in Saint-Julien, one I rated, I think I'm looking at my notes here, sorry, 97 to 99 plus points. They release their wine, and they're often quite parsimonious with their pricing. They released it at a 40% drop to last year's pricing. Now, on the headline news there is wonderful, it's great, and that's a really promising sign. Anything reduced by 40% is going to be good for consumers. However, just to play into that and give you some more transparency, they had put their prices up quite a lot last year. So whilst it's a 40% drop, we're not quite coming close to those 2019 prices yet. However, it is really promising, and at the score of the wine, it falls on Livex's fair value curve. Fair value is a algorithm or a formulae that Livex, the stock exchange for wine is what I call it, uses to determine whether a wine is fair value or not. And essentially that process is marking, in most cases, the scores from the top critics. In this case, particularly someone like Neil Martin, although of course Jane Atson, Jeb Dunnock, William Kelly are all equally important critics. But Neil Martin's scores tend to move the market demonstrably, and they'll plot scores against release prices or market prices, and they'll work out, if this wine this year is 99 points, then a price of £1,000 a bottle, £1,000 a case would be fair value. There's a lot more to it than that. But Léopold Lascasse is fair value this year. So that's a really good sign from a chateau, as I say, which isn't normally known for being particularly generous. Even better than that is Chateau Lafite. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, owned by Domaine Baron de Rothschild, made almost a 32% reduction. Lafite is a super brand. It's one of the most widely known brands in all of wine. They make fantastic wine that's there to be drunk and enjoyed. That's the most important thing. And this year is one of the best Lafite's I've ever tasted. I think they've captured the freshness and the intensity of the vintage without ever losing that minerality and that structure and freshness. Du Milon is an amazing wine this year. It's my favourite vintage of drinking it, or certainly tasting it. I will be drinking it. And so they made great wines across their estate, and they've dropped their prices. And Lafite don't really need to. Now, they should, of course. But there is such a global demand for Lafite as a wine, as an asset for people that are into that side of things, that a 32% drop is really, really good. And the Livex fair value chart for Chateau Lafite in 2023 is extremely compelling. It's miles below the fair value line, which is a really good sign. It's imminently investable if people are into that. Though I stress that Lafite is a work of art that should be enjoyed in the glass. And if I get the chance to enjoy it at some point in the future, if I win the lottery, I'll be a very happy man. So 2 big releases so far, and with very generous 32 and 40% drops in price. So the signs are good. If you're a producer now, you sort of have to keep up the Joneses. You have to sort of be releasing your wines around the 30 to 40% drop off, unless you have very good reasons not to. For consumers, for negotiants and brokers like me, and then you, the clients and customers, we have a lot of choice this year, because we should have a lot of choice because yields are up, which means that if a chateau is being greedy and only reducing the prices, say by 6 to 10% or up to 15%, then we can go elsewhere and we can get great quality wines at bigger price drops that offer better value. So the power is back with the buyer now. And I think if the chateau, which are going to be releasing their wines over the next month, don't get their act together and make really, really big gestures in price cuts, as Lafite and as Léville Las Casses have done, then they'll be left out in the cold. And buyers and people like me will go elsewhere. And finally, to finish, a little from me on my picks of the vintage. The first thing I'll say is I treat this, hopefully, as agnostically as I can. I'm judging wines on how good they are in the glass. And there are certain wines, for example, like Pape Clement, which I've found quite hard to taste in the past and very sort of almost too much each year. But I found it brilliantly supple and fresh and fruity in 2023. Wines like Pape Clement and other wines across Bordeaux, where I didn't let my expectations based on other vintages of the wine cloud how I scored it. And that's really hard to do, but I believe I did that. Now, I am the managing director of Clos Fine Wine. We're a very small wine business, and that means I don't have perhaps the buying power of some of the really big London dealers. That's not a bad thing. It means I can be really quite assiduous with what I select to offer to my clients. For me, I will always offer clients wines that I would buy for myself. That's for me is the marker. These are either wines for drinking from £6 to £7 a bottle, all the way up to those great wines if I had the money. So that's my first benchmark. Would I buy the wine myself? I'll never offer a wine which I wouldn't. And then when it comes to wines which people view as assets for investment, I have a algorithm tool which I built, which obviously needs some input from me as well. But that has a key set of criteria which I would judge the wines on. It's not enough for a wine to get a certain score. Yields come into it. It's not enough for a wine to be dropped in price 40%. That's not enough for it to be investable. And I would say to you watching it, hopefully if you haven't been bored to death by this video so far, you're about to get a lot, or already have got a lot of emails every day from all the brokers that you sign up for email alerts from. And you'll be offered lots of must-buy wines and wines which are the greatest ever and which are great investments because the price has gone down for 30%. My top tip would be to stop and pause and ask questions. And if you'd like to get in contact with me, please do ask me. I'm very happy to help. You needn't necessarily buy with me, But ask tough questions. Ask about how the price drop is relative to, for example, the pricing of the 2019 vintage, which was released during COVID, at a time when there was sort of a similar financial instability in the world. Ask about the yields. How high were they up? How does that relate to the pricing? Is it fair that the properties only drop prices by 20%? Should they not be 50% lower? Because last year they were up 80%, and so on and so forth. I'm exaggerating, but ask tough questions, because this is a vintage where there's a lot of quality on offer, and if the prices are right, there'll be a lot of value too. And so it's really up to the buyers, which are the people on the street, and the consumers, to decide what you want. And you have a lot of power, and you should really exercise that. I'd love it if you bought wines with me, obviously, but there are lots of wonderful merchants out there, big and small, not just in the UK, but around the world. The key thing is that people get the opportunity to try these wines, because they really are worth, even if you're not sure about en primeur, you haven't done it before, take a punt, buy a case of 12 bottles of Beaumont, Chateau Beaumont, which is owned by Chateau Bechevel. It's a brilliant wine. It's often somewhere between £8 and £9, if that, £7, £8, £9 a bottle in bond. So, for around about £100 or so, just over £100, you can have a case of 12 Bordeaux, which will give you a lot of drinking joy when they're delivered in 2 years. And if you are into investing in wine as an asset, there should be plenty of wines which will deliver for you, which is something the wine industry really needs, because it's been a tough 18 months. Anyone that's had wine as an investment will know that, like a lot of other financial markets, wine has gone down in value. It retains a certain value because it's a hedge against inflation. It's a physical asset. Chateau Lafite is always Chateau Lafite, or Chateau Montrose is always Chateau Montrose. It's not a piece of paper, it's a real thing. But it's been a tough time for alternative assets. And that's been driven by some of the sort of, greedy pricing, I think, of the last campaign. So if Chateau get the pricing right, the Bordeaux 2023, then it should be much more attractive for people like you and me to buy. And that means that there's a whole renewed confidence in wine, and that we're all getting value. And that can only be a trickle-down thing in a positive way for other regions like Champagne and the Rhone and Italy and so on and so forth. So do ask around, do shop around. But if you want to ask me for tips, or you have any general questions about Bordeaux, please do get in touch. I'd be really happy to help you. For me, though, some of the highlights were Lafite Rothschild on left bank. I thought was one of the finest wines I've ever tried. I thought Mouton Rothschild was excellent. The second wines, Carrad, Lafite, Petit Mouton, equally brilliant. I thought Du Harmillon, also from Domaine Barons Rothschild, was really fantastic. I gave that 95 points, and I think that's going to be a real sort of canny buy this year. Other wines, other regions, up in Saint Estèphe, I thought that Montrose was fantastic. I'm just looking at my notes here. Montrose, I thought, was up there towards 99 points. I didn't give a single wine 100 points this year. Shows what I know, because a couple of critics did give a couple of 100-point scores out. But for me, there weren't any wines that immediately struck me as perfection, and I didn't have the chance, like critics, to try 2 or 3 or 4 times. So the highest scores I gave were sort of 97 to 99 plus. So there's a potential for it to get near 100, but I wasn't confident enough to say so. But Montrose was certainly up there. I thought Calon-Segur was great up in Saint Estèphe. In Saint Julien, Léville Lascasse, a really fantastic offering. Bechevel is always wonderful. I thought that was fantastic. Clos de Marquis was fantastic, and Talbot, Chateau Talbot, which is one of the sort of the more affordable properties, made a really good wine in my book. Back in Pauillac, I've mentioned Lafite and Mouton Rothschild. Ponce Canet made a brilliant wine, and their prices came down again. They were released last week, and really, really well priced wine, really attractively priced, fantastic, juicy, fruity. I've got a case of Ponce Canet at home of a 16 vintage, and it's just a wonderful wine to drink, completely biodynamic. So I really would encourage people to look into that. Pichon Lalande, Pichon Comtesse, and their second wine, which they don't call their second wine, their other wine, Reserved Comtesse. I thought that was fantastic. Margaux, Raoul Zancella, I thought was absolutely brilliant. I love that. Also Siran, Chateau Siran, and Lascombe I thought were great. Marquis de Terme was a really, really well made wine in 2023. I think it's definitely one to follow because it's, again, often much more affordable than some of the other wines in the appellation. In Pessac, Aubailly, I thought made a brilliant wine. Le Carme Briand, as usual, a very good wine. For me, not as great as in previous vintages, but I thought Aubailly was very, very good. For me, of the Aubrions, I thought Aubrion, the first growth Aubrion, was up there towards the high scores. I think I gave it up to 98 or 99 points. 99 points, 98 points, sorry. And for me, there was a quite clear daylight between that and La Mission. I thought it had much more going. La Mission was very floral, very opulent, but it didn't quite have ultimately the structure and persistence, for me personally, to make it sort of in the same bracket as Aubrion. Pot and Sac and Beaumont, they're my two tips for really good value drinking wines that are going to give you so much pleasure in bottles, in magnums, in large formats. So Pot and Sac for me, Beaumont. In Pomerol, Église Clinée is extraordinary. Neil Martin gave it 100 points, well, potentially 100 points. L'Evangile, which is again owned by the Rothschild, Domaine Baron Rothschild, a wonderful Pomerol. Every year it gets better and better and better, and this was one of the best years yet. I gave it 96 points. Sorry, 94 to 96 points. So I thought that was fab. And then looking at Saint-Emilion, Cheval Blanc, again, made a wonderful wine. For me, it wasn't quite perfection, but I gave it 98 to 99 plus points, which probably sounds like a bit of a nonsense, but it was very close to perfection for me. It was really wonderfully made. Chateau Canon, I'm biased because I love that wine. I think it captures the joy of Bordeaux, the freshness, the fruit, the florals, the wild berries and blueberries and damson and herbs and spice. Just wonderful wine. And I love that. I gave that 96 to 98 points. So again, not perfection, but getting there, and really, really worth looking at. Another couple of great value wines, Grand Maine and Berliquet, both in Saint-Emilion, made wonderful wines. I really enjoyed tasting them. And then on the right bank satellites, I thought Chateau Aiguille and Alcé were wonderful, and La Dauphine and Dahlem were really well made wines that will offer great drinking pleasure. So I could go on forever, but there are a good sort of maybe 20 to 25 core wines that I enjoyed. But there's a link below in this video, or hopefully on the video or in the link, for my published report, and that's viewable online. You can download it or read it online or print it off, whatever you want to do. That's got my overview of the vintage. I've got a vintage report on there as well about the weather conditions, and it includes my picks from each of the appellations, plus some value picks as well. So do give that a read if you'd like to. That's completely free. You can look at that or use it as a doorstop or something if you don't like it. Do please feel free to subscribe to this small fledgling channel. I will, as I did last year, do a post Bordeaux primeur evaluation of how the campaign's gone and look at some of the opportunities after the official end of the campaign. So if you subscribe to this video, then you'll get those updates for when that video comes up. I'll also be doing some videos in the coming months about wine as an asset, which is something I'm quite confident in talking about. It's a big part of what Clos does, but also there's some really exciting releases from other regions which I'd like to do videos on. So do subscribe. If you'd like any of the Clos Fine Wine offers as they come out, I don't tend to deluge people with offers as they arrive. I tend to pick a few and then do an offer and then send them out as and when. So if you'd like to receive those offers, they're few and far between, but do go to closfinewine.com and subscribe to our mailing list, and I can send you those emails as they come through. If you'd like any buying advice or generally have any questions about Bordeaux or the vintage itself, do get in touch. I'd be really happy to talk to you or to answer your questions via email or through YouTube in the comment section. So thank you for spending your time watching this video. I hope it's been sort of remotely interesting for you and informative. And happy buying for En Primeur. If the prices are right, this could be a really exciting year. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you soon.